73 years. That's how long a 6-year-old boy named Luis Albino stayed missing, taken from a park in broad daylight by a woman in a green bandana. His mother searched until the day she died, but in 2024, a simple DNA test changed everything. Because Luis wasn't dead, he was alive, living under a different name with no memory of being kidnapped. This is the story of the longest missing child case ever solved with a living reunion. And it started with a granddaughter who took an ancestry test just for fun. Oakland, California, February 21st, 1951. It was a mild Wednesday afternoon in the post-war years of California. In a neighborhood park on Brush Street, children played tag and swung from monkey bars. Two brothers laughed as they chased each other across the grass. 6-year-old Luis and his 10-year-old brother, Roger Albino, were recent arrivals to the neighborhood. The family had moved from Puerto Rico just a year earlier, part of a wave of immigrant families seeking new opportunities on the mainland. The boys spoke mainly Spanish at home and were still picking up English at school. But on the playground, none of that mattered. They were just two kids enjoying a carefree day. Luis was a petite boy with dark hair and an infectious smile. He idolized Roger, who had a protective streak for his younger brother. On this particular day, Roger kept a watchful eye as Luis dug in the sandbox. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as other children started heading home for supper. The Albino boys knew they should be getting back soon, too. Their mother liked them home before dark. But just a few more minutes of play, they thought. As the brothers played, a woman in her early 30s approached the park. She was a stranger to them, wearing a bright green bandana tied over her hair. She watched the boys for a moment before walking over with a friendly wave. Speaking in smooth Spanish, she struck up a conversation. Roger glanced up warily at this unknown lady. In 1951, there were no widespread stranger danger campaigns. No common knowledge that kids shouldn't talk to unfamiliar adults. Still, something about the situation put Roger on mild alert. But Luis, being only 6 and naturally trusting, gave a big smile when the woman addressed them in Spanish, the same language his family spoke at home. She felt familiar in that sense, like someone from their community. The woman chatted with him casually, asking their names and ages. Roger noticed she seemed very interested in Luis in particular. Then she offered the boys a treat. "If you come with me, I'll buy you some candy," she said, smiling brightly. Luis's eyes lit up at the mention of candy. He was just a little kid. The promise of sweets from a seemingly kind adult was hard to resist. Roger, on the other hand, hesitated. Something in his gut told him this wasn't right. Who was this lady? And why was she offering candy out of the blue? Before Roger could say much, the woman gently took Luis's hand. "Come on, mijo. The store is just over there," she cooed, gesturing vaguely beyond the park. Luis innocently jumped to his feet, ready to follow. Roger trailed behind them as they started walking, not wanting to be left out if there was candy to be had, but also increasingly anxious. They exited the park and headed down the sidewalk. Roger noticed the woman was walking quickly, holding Luis by the hand. After a block or two, Roger's unease grew. This route wasn't toward any store he knew. In fact, they seemed to be heading further from the Albino's neighborhood. The woman's grip on Luis's hand was firm, almost urgent. Roger's heart beat faster. At 10, he might not fully comprehend the concept of kidnapping, but he knew when something felt wrong. He pipes up, "Excuse me, where are we going? I thought the candy store was near the park." The woman glanced back at Roger. Her friendly demeanor slipped just a little. "It's a little farther. Just keep coming," she replied curtly, still in Spanish. Roger slowed his steps. A cold prickle of fear ran through him. He was now several paces behind, and he noticed the woman subtly pulling Luis along faster. Suddenly, Roger made a decision. This wasn't right, and he needed to tell Mom. He called out, "Luis, I'm going to get Mom." Perhaps he hoped this would scare the woman into stopping, but she didn't even turn around. Roger turned on his heel and sprinted back toward home, legs pumping with adrenaline and dread. He yelled his little brother's name a couple of times as he ran, but Luis and the woman had already rounded a corner and disappeared from sight. Within minutes, Roger burst through the front door of their modest home, gasping for breath and shouting in a mix of Spanish and broken English to his mother. Antonia Albino was a strong 33-year-old mother of 6. She had been tidying up, expecting her boys home any minute. When Roger came racing in, wide-eyed and terrified, he blurted out the story. A lady at the park took Luis, promised candy. They walked away, and now Luis was gone. At first, Antonia struggled to understand. Her English was limited, and Roger was babbling frantically, but she caught the words Luis and mujer, woman, dulces, candy, and the sight of her eldest son's panic told her enough. Her baby boy had been taken. Antonia's heart nearly stopped. She didn't waste a second. Still dressed in her apron, she dashed out the door with Roger in tow and raced down the streets toward the park, calling out Luis at the top of her lungs. Neighbors turned their heads, and a couple of folks stepped outside, alarmed by the sight of this frantic mother. They reached the little park. The swing swayed empty in the breeze. The sandbox was deserted. There was no sign of Luis, nor the mysterious woman in the green bandana. Antonia's chest tightened. She felt faint with terror, but she refused to collapse. She had to find her son. She questioned the few people still around. ¿Han visto a mi niño? Have you seen my little boy? She was crying, grabbing strangers' arms. A teenage girl who had been sitting on a bench said she vaguely noticed a woman walking off with a small boy, but she assumed it was his mother and didn't pay much mind. That confirmation sent a chill through Antonia. Some stranger truly had her child. As the reality set in, Antonia let out a wail of despair. It was a primal, heart-rending cry that echoed across the emptying park. Roger stood by, tears streaming down his face, feeling helpless and guilty. He was still just a kid himself, and he didn't have the words to comfort his mother. All he could say over and over was, "She took Luis, Mama. I'm sorry. She took him." Night fell on Oakland. What began as a sunny afternoon of play had transformed into every parent's worst nightmare. Antonia knew she needed help. Through sobs and broken English, she managed to get someone to call the authorities. Soon, patrol car lights bathed the street in red and blue flashes as 2 officers arrived at the Albino home. The officers faced an immediate challenge: the language barrier. Antonia spoke mostly Spanish and only a little English. The Oakland police of 1951 had few Spanish-speaking officers. Roger tried his best to translate his mother's pleas. He explained what happened. A woman with a bandana lured his brother away with promises of candy. But as a frightened 10-year-old struggling to communicate, Roger's story initially raised eyebrows. The police asked him the same questions over and over. Who was this woman? Did you recognize her? What exactly did she say? Roger, choking back tears, described her. She had something green on her head. She spoke Spanish. She said she'd get Luis candy. He didn't recognize her. She was a stranger. One officer quietly wondered if Roger might be making up a wild story to cover for some accident. Child abductions by strangers were exceedingly rare in those days, almost unheard of. Another officer looked around the modest living room of the Albino home and saw family photos, including one of 6-year-old Luis grinning gap-toothed at the camera. This was a real child now missing. Whether or not they believed Roger's candy-wielding kidnapper tale, a little boy was gone, and they had to respond. Within hours, the Oakland Police Department launched a citywide search. They started at the park, combing for any clues, a dropped toy, footprints, any witness who might have seen where the woman went. They knocked on doors through the neighborhood, asking if anyone saw a young Puerto Rican boy being led away. A few neighbors joined in, forming small search parties to canvass the surrounding streets and alleys with flashlights. As the evening deepened, Antonia could barely keep upright. She clutched her rosary in one hand and a small photograph of Luis in the other, alternating between numb shock and waves of panic. Each time she heard footsteps or a voice outside, she rushed to the door, hoping someone was bringing her son back. But each time, it was just another neighbor or officer with no news. By midnight, this had escalated beyond a routine missing child call. The description of a possible abductor, a woman in her 30s, Spanish-speaking, wearing a bandana, had been broadcast to all local law enforcement. Oakland police coordinated with nearby departments. They weren't taking chances. If there was even a possibility a predator kidnapped a child, they had to act swiftly. Early the next morning, soldiers from a nearby U.S. Army base volunteered to help in the effort. Dozens of military personnel in fatigues joined police officers and civilian volunteers to scour a roughly 9-block radius around the park. They searched backyards, sheds, alleys, any place a child might be hidden or restrained. In 1951, there was no unified 911 system or Amber Alert to instantly spread the word, but local radio stations picked up the story. Missing 6-year-old boy in West Oakland. Possible abduction by a woman, last seen wearing a green bandana. The news traveled through the Bay Area by word of mouth and radio bulletins. Tips started to trickle in. Somebody at a bus stop thought they saw a woman with a crying boy matching that description. Another person reported a child's shout near the railroad. Each tip was followed up, but none led anywhere concrete. It was as if the woman and Luis had vanished into thin air. The Oakland police, uncertain if Luis truly was snatched or perhaps wandered off on his own, considered all possibilities. There was a grim theory floated early on. What if little Luis fell into the water and drowned? The park wasn't far from San Francisco Bay, and a wandering child could conceivably reach the waterfront. To rule this out, the U.S. Coast Guard was called in. Over the next day, Coast Guard boats patrolled the bay and its inlets, searching for any sign of a small body. Divers checked the murky shallows around the docks of Jack London Square and other nearby waterways. It was an agonizing sight for Antonia. She heard that they were searching the water, and the thought that police think her son might be dead in the bay was almost too much to bear. She vehemently insisted to anyone who would listen. No, no. Mi hijo está vivo. My son is alive. He was taken. One of Luis's cousins later recounted riding with Luis's grandfather back to the area as soon as they got the call that Luis was missing, arriving during the active search on February 21st. Antonia's side of the family was fully cooperative and just as desperate for answers as everyone else. The search of the water turned up nothing. No trace of Luis. On one hand, that was a relief. No news in this case meant he wasn't found drowned, but on the other hand, it deepened the mystery. If he didn't fall in the bay and drown, where was he? A child doesn't just evaporate. As day turned to night and back again, 48 hours had passed since Luis disappeared. The newspapers picked up the story, at least in the local press. The Oakland Tribune printed an article describing the missing boy and the desperate search, even including a grainy photograph of Luis and Roger together, taken not long before that fateful day. The community was on edge. Parents clutched their children a little closer, realizing a stranger abducting a child was a terrifying possibility. But despite the media attention and the intense search, no solid leads emerged. Police detectives interrogated Roger repeatedly in those first days, pressing him for every detail he could remember. Each time, Roger recounted the same basic story. A woman came up to them, spoke Spanish, wore a bandana, promised candy, and led Luis away. Yes, he followed at first. No, he didn't recognize her. Yes, she seemed to know how to talk to kids. No, he never saw a car or a license plate. She was on foot, walking fast. Roger, just a child himself, felt guilty and traumatized. The investigators weren't harsh with him, but they were persistent, likely because they had so little else to go on. Roger's information was the only eyewitness account of the abduction. They had to be absolutely sure it was accurate and hoped he recalled something more useful, like a distinctive feature of the woman or where she might have headed. Meanwhile, Antonia was living every second in tortured uncertainty. She barely ate or slept, instead spending her time at the police station or out with search parties until exhaustion forced her to rest. Because she didn't speak English, each interaction with authorities required a translator, a kind neighbor, or sometimes one of her older children if they knew more English from school. Despite the communication gap, the local police came to know her by sight and by unwavering determination. For the first few weeks, Antonia arrived at the police precinct every single morning. Officers saw this grief-stricken mother walk in as soon as the doors opened, hoping for any news about her little boy. Every day, the answer was the same. No news, no progress. They gently told her, "Lo siento." "No hay noticias, ma'am." Nothing yet. Antonia would go home in tears, only to return the next day and ask again. The empathy of some officers began to wear thin as the trail grew cold. With each day that passed, the likelihood of finding Luis dwindled in their minds. Other cases and duties piled up. Oakland was a big city, And in 1951, there were many challenges: crime, post-war adjustments, and a police force not equipped with modern tools we have today. Eventually, the exhaustive search efforts were scaled back. The soldiers returned to base. The Coast Guard resumed normal patrols, and volunteers had to go back to their lives. A small corps of detectives continued to investigate. But without leads, Luis's case slid into that dreaded category, a cold case. Weeks turned into months. The missing posters that were tacked to telephone poles and shop windows faded and torn. Tips completely dried up. The woman with the bandana remained a phantom. No one came forward with any clue to her identity. There was no physical evidence to examine. In 1951, forensic science was primitive anyway. No security cameras to check. No DNA testing. Not even an FBI missing children database existed yet. Luis's disappearance seemed to be a tragic one-off incident with no explanation for the police. It was frustrating and demoralizing. For the Albino family, it was life-shattering. Yet through this darkness, Antonia never truly succumbed to despair. Every single day, she prayed for her boy. She lit candles beneath the crucifix in her home, pleading with God to keep Luis safe until he could be found. She refused to entertain the idea that he might be dead. There was a powerful maternal intuition combined with raw hope that told her he was alive somewhere. Someone was caring for him. Perhaps that thought was what kept her going. The notion that maybe, just maybe, Luis was in a home somewhere out there, growing up and living, even if it was without her. At first, Antonia continued her daily pilgrimage to the Oakland police station. Nearly every morning she showed up, often carrying a small bilingual flyer with Luis's photo, which she thrust into the hands of any official who would pay attention. The officers at the Missing Persons Bureau came to expect her arrival. Some days she brought one of Luis's older siblings or a neighbor to help translate and plead his case. One can only imagine how heart-wrenching those encounters were. A mother with red-rimmed eyes, wordlessly searching their faces for any hint of news, and the officers slowly shaking their heads in apology. After a year of no answers, some people might have given up, but Antonia was not most people. Though as time went on, she could not maintain the daily visits. Life and her other children required attention. She settled into a ritual of visiting the police station once a week. Every week, she showed up and asked, "Noticias de mi hijo?" Any news of my son? And every week, she was met with the same gentle, regretful headshake. Oakland's police, to their credit, did not forget the case entirely. Occasionally, a new detective was assigned to review old files, or an out-of-state child matching Luis's description turned up, and they investigated the possibility, always ending in disappointment. Each year, around the anniversary of his disappearance, maybe a small blurb ran in the local paper to remind the public that Luis was still missing. But with no new information, interest waned. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the world rapidly changed around the Albino family. The older children grew up into young adults, starting lives, and families of their own. Roger, the protective brother who witnessed the abduction, carried guilt and trauma with him. In quiet moments, he replayed that day in his mind. What if he hadn't let Luis go? What if he had screamed for help sooner or followed further? These unanswerable questions weighed on him. He too kept hoping his little brother would be found. Perhaps he scoured crowds wherever he went, wondering if one day he'd just bump into a familiar face that looked like an older version of Luis. Around 1966, a flicker of hope emerged. Luis would have been 21 years old that year, an adult. If he were alive, he might have had to register for the draft or take a military service exam as the Vietnam War was ramping up. The Albino family seized on this idea. Maybe somewhere in government records, a 21-year-old man with Luis's name or birthday might appear. It was a long shot, especially if he'd been given a new identity, but the family didn't want to miss any chance. They petitioned authorities and scoured whatever public records they could access. Some family members even traveled back to Puerto Rico, thinking perhaps the kidnapper could have taken Luis back there. After all, the woman spoke Spanish. Maybe she had roots in their old community. For a few months, energy was renewed in the search. Roger and another sibling, maybe a sister or brother, accompanied Antonia on trips, asking questions, showing photos, chasing rumors. Unfortunately, every lead turned into a dead end. There was no sign of Luis in military records under his birth name. The trips to Puerto Rico came up empty. Relatives there had no information, and no one recalled a random child appearing in the area back in the 1950s. The disappointment was crushing, but Antonia still did not surrender hope. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the landscape of missing children cases began to ever so slowly shift. High-profile child abductions in later decades, like Eaton Pat's in 1979, would eventually lead to changes like faces on milk cartons and nationwide alerts. But all that was still in the future. For Antonia, the only constant was her steadfast belief that one day her son would return to her. Her weekly police station visits became monthly as the years passed. She aged visibly. Her hair grayed, wrinkles deepened, but the detectives at Oakland PD still recognized her. By now, new generations of officers had heard the story of the mother who never stopped looking for her boy. When Antonia came in yearly by the 1980s, she hardly needed to speak. The desk sergeant would see her and simply lower his eyes sadly. "No news, Mrs. Albino." She'd nod, perhaps shed a tear, and quietly leave, the weight of decades of uncertainty on her shoulders. Inside her wallet, Antonia kept a laminated clipping from a 1951 newspaper, the one reporting Luis's abduction. It was folded and worn, but she carried it everywhere, like a talisman. She also kept a portrait of 6-year-old Luis on the wall of her home, garlanded with a palm frond on the anniversary of his disappearance every year. To other family members and friends, it might have seemed like an obsession that kept her wounds forever fresh. But for Antonia, this ritual, this remembrance, was how she kept her boy alive in her heart. She could not forget, would not forget. Time was merciless. By the turn of the millennium, 5 full decades had passed. The new century arrived, and Antonia was now in her late 80s. Many of Luis's siblings had grandchildren of their own. The family had grown and changed so much, yet one piece had always been missing. In living rooms, at family gatherings, they often reminisced about Puerto Rico, about coming to California, and inevitably about Luisito. Nieces and nephews who never met him still felt like they knew him because the story had been told so many times. He was the legend of the family, the boy who disappeared. Over the years, some relatives privately assumed Luis must have died long ago, but no one ever voiced that to Antonia. They respected her unbreakable conviction that Luis was alive somewhere, and maybe deep down, they too nurtured a small flame of hope, however faint. In 2005, at the age of 92, Antonia Albino passed away. It was a gentle death in her sleep, after a long life filled with both great hardship and great love. In her final years, even as memory began to slip, she would still ask occasionally, "Donde está Luis?" Where is Luis? It became clear she never stopped waiting for him to walk through the door. Her funeral was attended by all her surviving children and dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. As they celebrated her life, they also acknowledged the sorrow she carried to her grave. She never found out what happened to her little boy. A framed photo of Luis as a 6-year-old sat atop her coffin, placed there by Roger or one of the others, an homage to Antonia's undying hope that was now passed on to her family. It seemed that any chance of discovering Luis's fate might have died with Antonia. After all, who else would pursue it so relentlessly? The case was 54 years cold by 2005, and the world had moved on. But the story of Luis Albino does not end here. Unknown to his grieving family, Luis himself was very much alive through all those years, living a life parallel to theirs, ignorant of the drama that had defined his early childhood. The miracle that Antonia prayed for was still possible, and it would come about not by chance or by standard police work, but by the powerful, invisible threads of DNA and the determination of a new generation. Fast forward to 2020. The year is 2020. Alida Alquin, a 63-year-old woman living in the Bay Area, had always been curious about her ancestry. She was one of Antonia's granddaughters, the daughter of one of Luis's siblings. All her life, Alida had heard the haunting family legend of Uncle Luis, who went missing as a little boy. She grew up with that faded newspaper clipping and her Abuela Antonia's stories. Even though she wasn't born when it happened, Luis's disappearance left a mark on her family that trickled down through generations. Alida learned from a young age that her grandmother never gave up on finding her lost son. Now, with her grandmother and many of that older generation gone, the tale of Uncle Luis was a piece of family history that Alita figured would likely remain a mystery. At 63, Alita decided to take an online ancestry DNA test, one of those kits where you mail in a saliva sample and get back details on your genetic makeup and matches with relatives. She wasn't necessarily trying to solve the family mystery with this test. According to her, she did it just for fun. Perhaps she was curious about what parts of the world her ancestors came from, or maybe she hoped to connect with distant cousins she'd never met. These tests had become quite popular, revealing all sorts of surprises in many families. People discover unknown siblings, biological parents, or confirm stories of heritage. For Alita, maybe there was a flicker of hope. What if something came up related to Uncle Luis? But after nearly 70 years, it felt far-fetched. She sent off the test and waited. When Alita received her DNA results online, she likely scrolled through the report, expecting to see a breakdown of ethnic percentages, maybe a list of second or third cousins who'd also tested. But her eyes widened as she saw something completely unexpected, a close family match with an unknown man. In fact, the DNA site indicated about 22% shared DNA with this person. That percentage was significant. In genetic genealogy terms, 25% shared DNA typically means a first-degree relative, like a grandparent, grandchild, half-sibling, or an aunt-uncle relationship. 22% was just slightly below that, well within the range for an uncle or a half-uncle. Alita's heart likely skipped a beat. Could this be him? Could this be Uncle Luis? She double-checked the information. The match was listed as a man around the right age. The site might give an age range, or at least she could infer if he was of her parents' generation. She didn't recognize the name or username shown. This man wasn't someone in her known family tree, and the percentage was way too high for a random distant cousin. The realization dawned on her. The only logical person this could be was her long-lost Uncle Luis, or possibly a child of his. But a child of Luis who would share 12.5% with her if he was her first cousin would have a lower match percentage. 22% was closer than a cousin. It suggested the man himself. Alita's hands trembled as she processed this information. After nearly 7 decades, could it be that Luis was not only alive, but had also, perhaps unknowingly, taken a DNA test that wound up in the same database? With excitement and a sense of disbelief, Alita composed a message through the DNA service to this mystery man. Perhaps she wrote something like, "Hello, I see we have a significant DNA match. I'm trying to learn more about my family. Do you know of any relatives from Puerto Rico or anyone who was adopted? Please contact me." She hit send and waited, hopeful that this could be the breakthrough her family had only dreamed of. Days passed, then weeks. No response. Alita checked the website regularly, looking for a reply or at least to see if the message was read. Nothing. The man on the other end might not even be actively using the website. Some people mail in a test, glance at results, and never log in again. It was also possible the man was cautious or confused by the message from a stranger claiming a close relation. Alita was left in frustrating silence. Was this match truly her missing uncle? And if so, how could she reach him? Eventually, life's distractions pulled her attention away. The world in 2020 was chaotic with COVID-19, and perhaps the lack of response led Alita to shelve the idea for the time being. 4 long years slipped by. Early 2024. A lot had changed in the world since Alita first took that DNA test. Perhaps by now she'd heard more stories of genetic genealogy solving mysteries, news stories of cold case crimes cracked by identifying DNA, or reunions of families through these databases. Maybe she watched a documentary or read an article that sparked a thought. What about that match I found? One evening, Alita sat down, determined to make another attempt at solving the family mystery that her grandmother died never knowing, finding Uncle Luis. This time, Alita enlisted help. Her own daughters, Luis's great-nieces, now adults themselves, joined in the mission. It became a multi-generational effort. They gathered around a computer, digging for any information on the name attached to that DNA match. Perhaps with some clever internet sleuthing, they managed to find a person who could be him. It might be through public records, people finder sites, or even social media. If the man used his real name or a traceable username on the DNA site, they might uncover addresses, phone numbers, or at least some clues. In fact, according to later reports, Alita and her daughters decided to hit the library for old newspapers. They realized that to convince authorities, or even themselves, they needed solid evidence tying this unknown man to the little boy who vanished in 1951. So Alita visited the Oakland Public Library, where archives of the old Oakland Tribune were kept on microfilm. She threaded the reel and wound back time to 1951, scanning through the microfilmed pages. With a rush of triumph, she found the articles about her uncle's kidnapping. On one of those grainy pages, she saw a photograph of young Roger and Luis, taken in the aftermath of the abduction, likely a picture used in the paper to help find the boy. Roger, 10, and Luis, 6, were frozen in time in black and white, two innocent faces from a bygone era. Alita gazed at Luis's face in that photo, committing every feature to memory. She had seen the photo before, perhaps, but now it had renewed meaning. If her hunch was right, that little boy grew up to be the man on the other end of that DNA test. But she wanted to be sure. If the DNA wouldn't get immediate answers, maybe visual clues would. She took whatever information she had gleaned about the mystery man. Let's say she managed to find a name and maybe even a picture on the internet. It could be a profile picture from a public genealogy forum, or maybe his name tied to a mention in a local news story. Remember, he was a firefighter. Perhaps there was a feature on retired firemen, or a community piece that included a photo of him, or a Facebook profile of a person with that name. Alita compared that modern image to the cherished childhood photo of Luis. It might seem hard to connect a 6-year-old's face to a 70-something-year-old's face, but family resemblances have a way of enduring. Perhaps she noticed that the older man's eyes or the shape of his nose strongly resembled her relatives. Maybe he looked like her own mother, or had the Albino family's distinctive smile. Her conviction solidified. This had to be him. The odds of someone matching that much DNA and having even a passing resemblance were astronomical, unless he was family. And the only missing family of that closeness was Uncle Luis. Armed with the Tribune clippings, photos, and her DNA results, Alita approached the Oakland Police Department. It had been almost 73 years since the original crime. One imagines the front desk officer's astonishment when this determined woman came in and said, "I have information on a missing persons case from 1951. Perhaps initially they didn't know what she was referring to. But missing persons cases are never closed until resolved. She provided the details, her name, her relation to Luis Albino, the story passed down, and now this DNA match that indicated he might be alive on the East Coast. At first, it might have sounded far-fetched, but consider the timing and context. By 2024, police were well aware of the power of DNA and genealogy. They also knew that stranger things had happened in cold cases. The Oakland Police Missing Persons Unit listened to Alita. According to official accounts, on March 18, 2024, Alita formally presented her findings and theory to the investigators. She essentially said, "I think my Uncle Luis, who was kidnapped as a child in 1951, is alive and living under another identity. And I believe I've found him." This must have been one of the most extraordinary claims they'd heard in a long time. But the evidence she brought, the DNA match percentage, the old newspaper photo, was compelling. It was enough that the Oakland Police Department reopened the missing person case of Luis Armando Albino, a case that had been cold for over 7 decades. Detectives who took on this case must have felt a surge of excitement at the possibility of cracking one of the oldest mysteries on the books, and also perhaps a sense of duty to finally give this family answers. The police didn't work alone. Given the potential interstate nature, kidnapping across state lines, and the sheer age of the case, they enlisted the help of the FBI and the California Department of Justice. The FBI in particular has jurisdiction over kidnapping cases that cross state lines. And even though this was long past, it technically remained an unsolved abduction. The involvement of these agencies meant resources and expertise were available that far surpassed what existed in 1951. It was like bringing a Cold War-era case into the age of supercomputers and genetic science. Investigators verified Alita's evidence and then likely contacted the DNA testing company to get any additional info on that match, perhaps a full name or contact info if available, though privacy rules are strict. Law enforcement can sometimes get data if it's a missing person scenario and not a criminal investigation per se. Or they might have asked Alita to message again, urging the match to check messages. Perhaps concurrently, they used public records and databases to narrow down who this man could be. Alita's work may have already given them a name and general location. Imagine the day they found a record. A man, let's say hypothetically John Doe for this story's sake, as we don't know his assumed name, who was about 79 years old living on the East Coast. With cautious optimism, FBI agents reached out to the man. This part was delicate. How do you approach someone with news that upends everything they know about themselves? Possibly they started by contacting one of his children or a relative from that side, but likely they went directly to the man to maintain discretion. One day, the man who was Luis, now in his late 70s, got a knock on his door or perhaps a phone call. It was the FBI or an official-looking group of investigators. One can imagine him puzzled. What business could the FBI have with a law-abiding retired fireman? They might ask him, "Did you ever take a DNA test? Or has anyone in your family?" Perhaps he said, "Yes, he did a while back, but thought nothing of it." They might then gently explain that they have reason to believe he might be connected to a very old missing child case. He was probably perplexed, maybe in disbelief, or even chuckled at the seeming absurdity. You think, "I'm a missing person. I've lived here my whole life. You must have the wrong guy." The investigators explained further. In 1951, a 6-year-old boy named Luis Albino was abducted from a park in Oakland. They had strong evidence suggesting that he was that boy. Try to put yourself in his position at that moment. The sheer cognitive dissonance of hearing that you might be someone who was kidnapped as a child 73 years ago. If he had any idea he was adopted, his thoughts might race. Could that story I was told about my birth not be true? If he had no idea, it would be even more jarring. How could I be someone else? Perhaps he laughed it off at first, but the agents presented something convincing. Maybe they showed him a copy of that 1951 newspaper with the photo of him as a boy. He peered at the image of the little child who vanished, and maybe a long-buried memory stirred, or maybe it was simply the familiarity of seeing his own 6-year-old face that he barely recalled. Inevitably, they asked for his cooperation to confirm via DNA. At this point, he likely agreed, maybe still thinking this was surreal, but what was the harm in a test? A simple cheek swab was taken. They already had a DNA sample from one of his siblings, Alita's mother, one of his sisters perhaps, who was still alive. DNA analysis was done, and it conclusively proved that he was indeed the biological son of Antonia Albino, brother to Roger and the others. In other words, he was Luis Armando Albino. What a moment that must have been when the results came in. For the investigators, it was a moment of triumph and astonishment. They had found a person who was a 6-year-old missing child and was today a living senior citizen. For Alita and her family back in California, it was almost like hearing someone found a ghost alive. They knew in their hearts he was alive, but to actually get that confirmation was overwhelming. On June 20th, 2024, Alita got the call she had been waiting for. The investigators informed her and her mother, Luis's sister, that Luis had been found alive. They likely visited in person to deliver this incredible news. Alita later recounted that she and her mother managed to hold their composure during the briefing, but once the officials left, they broke down in tears of joy, gripping each other's hands and crying, "We found him! We found him!" It was a moment she described as ecstatic, an almost miraculous fulfillment of a long-held hope. Imagine the flurry of preparations and emotions that followed in the next few days. They had a name and contact for Luis, but he himself was processing this news too. Did he immediately agree to meet his birth family? From all accounts, yes. He was open and even grateful. Perhaps in that short span between finding out and meeting them, he had to reconcile 73 years of life built on a certain narrative with this new reality. He might have felt shock, curiosity, maybe anger toward those who took him, or confusion about what to call himself now. But above all, he must have felt a strange excitement. He had blood relatives he never knew, and they had been looking for him for decades. Just days after confirmation, arrangements were made for a reunion. The FBI and local authorities assisted in coordinating what could be a media circus, but the family likely wanted some privacy initially. On June 24th, 2024, a plane landed in Oakland. A poetic full circle since decades ago. A plane took him away from Oakland. Luis, now about 79 years old, stepped off, possibly with one or more of his children by his side for support. What was going through his mind as he took in the sights of California? This might be his first time back since 1951. The smells, the light, the atmosphere might feel oddly familiar or entirely new. At a private location, perhaps Alita's home or another family member's house in Oakland, relatives gathered, buzzing with anticipation and nerves. There were likely many people, siblings, nieces, nephews, their kids. After all, he was one of 6 siblings originally, and now only a few might still be alive. We know Roger, now 83, was definitely waiting. Alita was there, the woman who cracked the case. Her mother, Luis's sister, was there, about 86 years old or so, heart pounding at the thought of meeting the baby brother she never thought she'd see again. The door opened, and Luis walked in. Alita saw the man who she only knew from an old photo and that one match on a computer screen. She described what happened. He walked up to her and immediately gave her a hug and said, "Thank you for finding me," then kissed her on the cheek. Such a simple statement, but it held a world of meaning. Luis, in that moment, understood that he had been lost, and someone cared enough to look for him and bring him home. He was expressing gratitude, as if she rescued him, though he wasn't in danger in his current life. Being found reconnected him with his identity and heritage in a way he never knew was missing. Tears streamed freely as Alita introduced him to other relatives in the room. Perhaps they had out photo albums, eager to share with him pictures of the mother he barely remembered or never knew he had. Pictures of his father or grandparents, if available. Stories about his siblings growing up. Did he know he was one of 6 originally? He might be stunned to find out how large his birth family was. Not long after this initial meeting in Oakland, the next day, they traveled to meet Roger, the brother whose quick thinking and courage back in 1951 set this whole saga in motion, and who had carried the burden of that day for so long. Roger was living in Stanislaus County, California, about a couple of hours away from Oakland in the Central Valley. It sounded like Roger, by this time, might be dealing with health issues given he would be 83. Alita drove Luis and her mother out to Roger's home. One can imagine the quiet car ride. Perhaps they were pointing out California landmarks to Luis, or maybe everyone was quiet, emotionally steeling themselves for the biggest reunion of all. Roger presumably knew his brother was alive now and coming. What would it be like to wait for the brother you lost at age 10 when you're an old man? Did he pace the living room, glance out the window every minute? Did he prepare anything to say or have questions lined up? He likely was overcome with emotion just at the thought. When they arrived, Alita helped her uncle, who was nearly 80, but still moving spryly, out of the car. They approached the door. Perhaps Roger came out onto the porch with tentative steps, and there they were, 2 brothers separated as children, now both old men face to face. Roger looked into Luis's eyes and perhaps, even after all these years, saw the little brother he once chased around the park. Luis saw an elderly gentleman with tears in his eyes and sensed a connection, a familiarity around the eyes or smile that mirrored his own. They closed the distance between them and embraced tightly. Observers described it as a really long, tight hug, the kind where neither wants to be the first to let go. In that hug, decades of pain and questions were answered without a word. Roger likely whispered or cried out, "Luisito," the childhood nickname, or just repeated, "I can't believe it." Or maybe they didn't speak at first, just held on and wept. They sat down together, arm in arm perhaps, and they talked for hours. There was so much to say about the day that changed everything. Roger might share details of what he remembered, and Luis could only piece together maybe a feeling or two if he recalled anything. They talked about the lives they'd lived. Roger might share about the family, who married, who had children, how their mother never stopped looking for him. That news could be emotional to hear, that his mother loved him so much and believed he was alive until her dying day. Luis may have felt a pang of sadness learning she passed in 2005 and he didn't get to see her, but also comforted that she never gave up on him. They compared notes on military service, since it turned out both brothers served their country. Maybe they were even in Vietnam around overlapping times without knowing it. They talked about careers. Roger heard that Luis was a firefighter, and perhaps Roger had his own career, Maybe he too served, or maybe he worked in some trade. They filled each other in on 73 years of life in as much detail as time allowed. For Roger, this reunion was the fulfillment of a lifetime of guilt and sorrow. Any notion he had that he failed his little brother was wiped away. His brother was alive, he survived, and he was okay. The relief and joy must have been immense. For Luis, it was a gift he probably didn't even know he wanted or needed, a chance to connect with his origins, to know who he was and where he came from. Many adopted people speak of a sense of completeness when they find their biological family, even if they had a wonderful adoptive life. For Luis, add to that the shock that he hadn't been given up, but actually stolen, and that his family always wanted him. That knowledge can be healing in its own way, validating that he was loved and missed deeply. Over the following days or weeks, Luis met other siblings, if any are still living, and numerous nieces, nephews, and their children. There must have been a big family gathering where an entire clan welcomed him home. They likely shared traditional Puerto Rican foods. Perhaps someone cooked arroz con gandules or other favorites that Luis might find oddly familiar or entirely new if his adoptive upbringing was different. They showed him family heirlooms or the small stash of memories Antonia had kept. Maybe she left behind notes or items that belonged to Luis as a child. It was a happy chaos of reunion. It was also overwhelming. Imagine, at nearly 80 years old, being plunged into a huge new family. But reports indicate Luis handled it with grace and happiness. He even spent an extended visit in July 2024 in California, staying longer to bond with his rediscovered family. Time, however, was not completely on their side. Shortly after this reunion, in August 2024, Roger passed away. Perhaps his health had been fragile, and he held on through sheer will to see his brother again. His passing was bittersweet, undoubtedly deeply sad for Luis and the family, but there was comfort in knowing that Roger's lifelong wish was granted. He got to hug his brother and know that he was safe and sound. When Roger left this world, he did so with peace in his heart, instead of the question mark that hung over him for 73 years. In a sense, it was as if Roger could finally let go, having seen the miracle happen. As for Luis, he returned to his home on the East Coast after that visit. But now, with open lines to his West Coast kin, he suddenly had an expanded family who wanted to make up for lost time. It's said that his life from then on would include both the family he knew, his children and grandchildren, who must have been stunned to learn that their father, grandfather, had an entirely different identity and family history, and the family he was born into. The kidnapping of Luis Albino is now a closed missing person case, but an open investigation as a crime. The Oakland police and FBI officially consider the kidnapping itself an active, albeit very cold case. They have one burning question: who was the woman in the bandana, and why did she do it? After all this time, that question remains elusive. What we do know from Luis's account and the investigation is scant. Luis, having been only 6 at the time and then living a completely different life, doesn't have answers. He didn't even know he was kidnapped, so he has no memory to offer beyond what might be hidden deep in his subconscious. The woman in the green bandana was described by Roger as being in her 30s in 1951, which means if, by some slim chance, she's alive today, she'd be over 100 years old. It's far more likely she went to her grave without facing justice or revealing her deeds. She could have been anyone: a neighbor with ill intent, a member of a trafficking ring, or, as many suspect, someone who abducted a child for the purpose of handing him over to a couple that wanted a child. That latter theory seems plausible given Luis ended up in a stable family environment. It might have been a black market adoption scenario, sadly not unheard of in the mid-20th century. The adoptive parents who raised Luis are another enigma. Did they know he was kidnapped? Or were they told, perhaps by the bandana woman, if she was an illegal broker of sorts, that the child was abandoned or an orphan in need of a home? If they were complicit criminals, it would cast his whole upbringing in a sinister light. But if they were unsuspecting and truly thought they lawfully adopted him, albeit likely without proper papers, then the real villain would be solely the kidnapper. Unfortunately, by the time Luis and law enforcement learned the truth, those who raised him had already passed away. Given Luis was almost 80, they would have been quite old as well. There's no opportunity to interrogate them or learn their side of the story. It's haunting to think that somewhere in old Oakland police files there's perhaps a composite sketch or a brief description of the suspect. A woman, 30s, bandana, Spanish-speaking, seen on that day. That description never matched anyone at the time, and now it's unlikely to ever be matched definitively to a real name. The paper trail in 1951 would be thin. Plane tickets weren't tracked like today. And if she used cash and a common name, nothing would stand out. The East Coast side of the journey left little trace, unless someone looked for a woman arriving with a child suddenly. Though the criminal side remains unsolved, the triumph of this story is that the victim was found alive. In the world of true crime and missing persons, that is a rare and precious outcome. Luis's case stands as one of the longest-running missing child cases where the child was found alive in U.S. history. It's nothing short of astounding. The story of Luis Albino teaches us never to lose hope. Antonia didn't live to see the day, but her hope was vindicated. One imagines that somewhere she's smiling, knowing her faith in her son's survival was proven true. The family's persistence, combined with modern technology, made the impossible possible. It also highlights the incredible power of genetics genealogy. Who could have guessed in 1951 that the key to finding Luis would not be a witness or a clue in a file, but rather a few cells swabbed from a cheek and a vast database comparing markers in DNA? This is truly a 21st century solution to a mid-20th century mystery. DNA doesn't forget. It carries the truth of who we are across generations, just waiting for someone to read it. As more people enter their DNA into databases, we can expect more of such miraculous reunions for other families, and also resolution of crimes that have long gone unsolved. The case of Luis Armando Albino remains technically open in terms of finding the perpetrator, but realistically, justice in the legal sense might never be served. Instead, justice has taken a more poetic form. A lost boy was returned to his family, showing that love and tenacity can outlast even the longest silences. For Luis, the story that began with a woman in a green bandana ended with a granddaughter who refused to let a mystery stay buried. For the Albino family, the wound that had defined them for 73 years finally began to heal. And for all of us watching this story unfold, it's a reminder that some endings are worth waiting for, no matter how long they take. 73 years is an unfathomably long time to be missing, but as this incredible true story proves, it's never too late for a miracle. Luis Armando Albino's journey home was overdue by a lifetime, but it arrived at last. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to Frozen in Time. We'll continue to bring you stories where science meets justice and families finally find answers. Because as we've learned today, no case stays cold forever when someone refuses to give up. Thank you for watching. And remember, DNA never forgets, even when everyone else does.